Well, good morning everybody. This is a short video just to prepare you for what we're going to be doing on Saturday. So, as discussed 2 Saturdays ago, there's no quiz for this Saturday. Rather, we're going to start with Calvin's comments on Genesis 14 through 16, and the questions are in the study guide on page 65, 64 and 65. As memory serves, and they're very helpful. And Calvin's a very astute commentator, and it helps for us to give careful attention to the text. And then what we're going to be doing in our lecture is we're going to be looking at Melchizedek as a special study, and of course he's prominent in that section of Calvin's commentary. And we're going to be looking at Dr. Pratt's methodology in lesson 2, and I would just remind you of two very important things that he says at the beginning of the lecture, just to orient you into our approach. So let me find that file. There we go. All right. So at the beginning of the lecture, in lecture 2, he said, Scripture was written for other people who lived thousands of years ago. That's very important. So as we try to understand how the Scriptures apply to our lives today, we must always be careful to base our modern applications on the original meaning of Scripture. And Dr. Pratt's method is to go look at Israel coming out of Egypt. At what stage of their leaving Egypt, whether it was the first generation or the second generation, we don't know, and he also doesn't know when exactly Moses presented this material to them, but maybe indeed several times over the course of their history. But that's very important. So in other words, often Christians are a little bit neglectful of this consideration, and we think that the scriptures were written to us in the 21st century, and that's that missing step of considering what it would have meant to Israel in their day often means that we get things misapplied in our day. So let me read another quote, a couple of pages down in the manuscript notes. Dr. Pratt says, these stories were originally written in the days of Moses. And he goes on to affirm, and I would 1000% agree with this, they are substantially the same now as they were then. But then he makes a comment. Most critical scholars, that is to say most Old Testament professors at colleges and universities all around the world, most critical scholars believe that these stories were not written in the days of Moses. And his answer is very important. Jesus himself insisted, Dr. Pratt goes on to say, that Moses did write Genesis. And Christians then should have affirmed the Mosaic authorship of this book. And that to me is absolutely vital. There's no reason except that you are not taking the scriptures as God has given them to us, to believe that Moses did not write this material with a great deal of care. So we're going to look at that care and just look at Dr. Pratt's methodology on Saturday. Very important. So in his addressing how what Moses had to say to them applied to them directly, he looked at three things. Backgrounds, that is to say, if something happened to Abraham, did it give them information about their own background as God's elect people in their own time, or models. Did Abraham do something, or did something happen to Abraham that was a model, an immediate lesson for them, so to speak, and then foreshadowings. In other words, were there things that Moses was telling them that were preparing them for the future as they would enter the land and conquer it and live there as a people under God. So those are very important considerations, and as you understand how this works out for Israel, that's really helps you then, and we'll look at this in lecture 3, to understand how these things apply to us. So he reproduces the major themes from the first lecture, that is to say, in Genesis 12, in those opening verses, there is, of course, God's divine grace to Abraham, the first theme, Abraham's necessary response of loyalty to the Lord, the second theme, and then God's blessing of Abraham, the third theme, and Abraham's then responsibility to be a blessing, the fourth theme. So how do these things work out in a particular instance? We're going to look at that, and that instance is, as I've already said, is Melchizedek. How do these themes apply to Melchizedek? And I've chosen Melchizedek because Dr. Pratt doesn't have a lot to say about him. Of course, there's limited time in his videos. He can't say everything, so we can test out his methodology for ourselves and see how it benefits us. And we need to bear in mind then, of course, the historical framework that Moses presents to us the account of Abraham in. Remember how there are 5 successive steps, and step number 1 is mirrored by step number 5. So step number 1, of course, is Abraham's background and his early experiences, and that's mirrored by Abraham's offspring, his progeny, and his death in section 5. And then section 2, Abraham's early encounters with other people, is mirrored by section 4, Abraham's later encounters with other people. And at the center of everything are chapters 15 through 17, God's covenant with Abraham, and how that is the fulcrum on which all of Abraham's life turns. So I think it's very helpful, and we're going to look at Melchizedek then in his particular place at the end of section 2, Abraham's early contact with other people, and on into section 3, God's covenant, because I think the shadow of chapter 14 and Melchizedek in it falls into, of course, chapter 15. So what do you need to do? Just by way of summary, please watch video 2 with some care, video 3 if you're able to, but particularly if you have time to read Calvin's commentary and to answer the questions that are put to you. I find it very helpful just to flip between the commentary and the questions and note the answers as I go. The questions really help to focus you on what Calvin is teaching and saying. And then, of course, you have to ask this question: do I agree with that? Has he grasped everything? What insights are there? And I think we'll have a good time on Saturday. 2 other little housekeeping things. Number 1, thank you for those of you who did send me your quizzes. I wasn't able to read all of them in the sense that some of what you sent me wasn't 100% clear to me, but I do appreciate it, and I hope these quizzes have served to awaken you to look for Abraham and how he functions in all of the scripture as you read it for yourself, and to see how important, especially in the New Testament, what it means to be a son or a child of Abraham, especially for us Gentiles, us Goyim. So that's the first thing. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. And then the second thing pertaining to the quiz was I made a mistake. On Saturday I was only thinking of Romans and Galatians, but of course Genesis 15:6 is also quoted in James chapter 2. So there are 3 instances in which that text is quoted, and we'll probably have time to give a little bit of attention to Genesis 15:6 on Saturday. And then the second major housekeeping thing is if you're able to come through, I see there's no Greek class on Saturday. If you're able to come through and have the class with us in the English Reformed Church building, that'd be really very appealing, especially to meet some of you who are taking the class whom I've not yet met. So please feel free to come, and come early. You can spend some time in the bookshop, and we'll have a cup of tea and a snack at about 10 after, 10 before the lecture, so come hungry. And we really look forward to having you there. And if you're coming, please just let me know so that we just make sure there's enough of everything prepared for everybody who will be with us. Anyway, Lord helping us, we'll have a really good lecture on Saturday. And so essentially we're going to be looking at Dr. Pratt's methodology, and we're going to be testing it out in one respect, the account of Melchizedek. That's going to be our chief focus, because he doesn't deal with Melchizedek, and we can then test and say, okay, does this methodology actually work? Well, I hope the Lord blesses us and teaches us his word and his way.